You may be asking yourself, how do you get started in making disciples? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about how you get started by looking at the primary goal of discipleship, which will empower that reality of how to make disciples. Coming up. Hey guys, my name is Mark, and I make powerful, practical, strategic content so you can make disciples right there in your context. And if this video is helpful, please leave us a comment. Love to hear from you, interact with you, like our videos, and subscribe to our channel. Okay, so Discipleship 101. Where do you start in this process of making disciples? Well, in my own journey, I've made a lot of mistakes around the process and journey of learning about disciple making. And I want to help you not have to make those same mistakes and get on the fast track of seeing disciples make disciples in your life. Now I say fast track, but making disciples is slow and it's messy. So I don't want to in any way put you on that there's some secret trick or tip to making disciples. It's a lot of work, it's hard, and you really have to dig in. So that may make you want to turn this video off, but I want to encourage you that that God is in this. So years ago, one of the first people that I began to learn about discipleship with was autistic, addicted to meth, and had a lot of broken family relationships. And it was in this discipling relationship that I really began to understand how not to make disciples as well as how to make disciples. That's where I really learned Discipleship 101. And I really am thankful now that this young man had these cards stacked against him in his life, because it really helped me to dig into what is discipleship. Nothing really seemed to be working. And what was helpful actually was sitting down with this young man, and as he began to really just be raw, because that's what happens when you are on the autistic spectrum, he was just really blunt and raw with me and saying, this sucks, this is boring, I don't understand why we're doing this, I'm not getting anything out of this, over and over again. So I just began to cry out to God and said, God, you've got to help me. He doesn't seem to be getting this. And so as I went back and I really began to understand the way Jesus modeled discipleship, and that helped me to recalibrate back to, oh yeah, this is what discipleship's all about, or making disciples. I saw that Jesus really simply modeled listening and responding to his Father. And as he began to really show that to his disciples, he called them into this same sort of relationship. He constantly said, I only do what I see the Father doing. I only say what I hear the Father saying. And then he begins to challenge his disciples to begin to do the same thing. He turns to Philip as the crowds surround them and they're all hungry, and he says, you give them something to eat. But that's not in a vacuum. It's after he has demonstrated to Philip the nature of a good God who loves his people and wants to provide for them and multiplying that food. Then he turns to Philip and says, you give them something to eat. In other words, come into this same relationship that I have with the Father and begin to do it as well. So as we begin to make disciples, it's really super key that we don't pass on to our disciples a process that we wouldn't do ourselves. How many times do we recommend to somebody a book? Oh, you got to read this book on this topic. Or we pass on to them some resource. But in reality, we don't usually dig into all the resources that are passed our way. Or how many times do we sit down in the morning as we begin to take time with God and we begin to thumb through a giant textbook in order to interact with God? No. What we usually do is we might use a devotional, we might use some prayer model or resource, but ultimately we want to dial into hearing God's voice for us. We don't know, what is he saying to us? And then we begin to respond to that in our lives. So if we pass on a process that's more complicated than that, we're being what Jesus would call a hypocrite. We're a hypocrite. We're teaching somebody to do something that we have no intention of practicing ourselves. That's the definition of what it means to be a hypocrite. So as we make disciples, let's engage in a process that we would want to do ourselves so that we pass on something that is actually duplicatable, which is listening and responding to God. This is what Jesus modeled. So what does that mean to begin to teach somebody to listen and respond to God? Well, listening. If you are in relationship with somebody, you've got to be able to listen to them, right? And part of listening and understanding somebody's words is knowing their character and having enough history with them to be able to understand their words in the context of who they are. Because you're interpreting what they're saying, not just the words themselves, but those words have a context of their character. The same is true with God. And as we begin to make disciples, we need to help those disciples to dial in and understand the character of God that they're beginning to listen to. And then they can't stop there. It's the response or putting those things into practice in our lives that begins to take that from mere information to a living experience. And that's the goal of discipleship, that we would begin to have an interaction with God the Father. And Jesus said in John 14 that his Father would come and draw near to us as we obeyed or put into practice the things that he commanded. So our goal is not simply new information, but practicing these things. As you begin to meet with your disciples, you can help them listen to God's voice using simple tools like a discovery Bible study, a way of simply beginning to engage with God's word, hearing his voice in it, by identifying what it says about the character of God, by identifying some things that he might be modeling, some practices he might be modeling in that passage, or to be obeyed, or some things to be believed, and then beginning to find ways to practice that in your life. So as we make new disciples, oftentimes new disciples don't have any context for the character or the nature of God, and that's super key to hearing his voice, right? That's what we just talked about. You've got to be able to know his character in order to hear his voice. This is the place of short-term discipleship. As we begin to help a new believer or an unbeliever begin to understand this God that they are meeting and beginning to respond to, we can't start simply with this place of what is God saying to you and how do you respond. There's an element to that in the relationship, even from the beginning, but we have to major on this place of introducing them to the character of God. And that's where we begin to look at a short story set of stories from the Bible that introduce us to the character of God and how we can begin to respond and practice this as the Christians have throughout the centuries. So check out the description below this video for some story sets that you can begin to engage disciples in to help them begin to understand who this God is. That's the beginning of this place of listening. And then responding, simply looking like identifying some ways to put into practice this passage that we've just interacted with. Commands to be obeyed, commands to be believed, and then challenging your disciple to not only put that into practice, but to teach somebody else and to begin to share it with others, because that's what disciples do. So, Discipleship 101, that's what we're talking about here. And it begins with identifying the central goal, which is connecting people with God the Father for themselves, and not giving them some process or curriculum or thing to do that becomes religious and doesn't actually help them engage with God the Father, which is the end goal. So focus on listening and responding, and check out that short-term discipleship list found in the description box and begin to practice this with a disciple in your life. Guys, I sure hope this has been helpful content, and if it has, please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and leave us a question, leave us a comment. We'd love to connect with you and talk with you more.